December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes forest sits frozen and silent under a blanket of fresh snow. First Lieutenant Lyle Book crouches in his foxhole on Lanzerath Ridge, staring into the darkness. He is 20 years old. Back home in St. Louis, his family is preparing for Christmas. Here, on this frozen Belgian ridge, he commands 18 men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 394th Infantry Regiment. They have been watching the German lines for days, reporting nothing unusual, but something feels wrong this morning. Bouk cannot see them yet, but across the valley, 200,000 German soldiers are waiting. Behind them sit nearly 1,000 tanks. Artillery pieces by the hundreds point toward American lines. Adolf Hitler has gambled everything on one last roll of the dice. Operation Watch on the Rhine. The offensive that will split the Allied armies and change the course of the war. In a few minutes, the largest German offensive since 1940 will begin, and standing directly in its path are Bouk and his 18 men. What happened over the next 9 days would transform an elite German division from the spearhead of Nazi conquest into a shattered remnant abandoned in a Belgian village. This is the story of ordinary American soldiers who did extraordinary things. The story of engineers who blew bridges under enemy fire. Of a major who created a wall of fire from burning gasoline. Of infantry divisions that refused to give ground no matter the cost. This is the story of the 9 days that broke the Leibstandarte. To understand what the Americans faced that December morning, you need to understand what the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler represented to Nazi Germany. This was not just any German unit. This was Hitler's personal division, his bodyguard, the men he trusted to protect him and to carry his banner into battle. They wore his name on their sleeves, embroidered in silver thread on black cloth. When they marched for the Führer himself. The Leibstandarte had been with Hitler since the very beginning of his rise to power. In 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor, his personal guard numbered just 117 men. They stood outside his office. They escorted him to rallies. They demonstrated absolute loyalty in a regime built on treachery and ambition. In 1934, Hitler called on them for a darker purpose. During the Night of the Long Knives, the Leibstandarte helped murder Ernst Röhm and the leadership of the SA. They proved they would kill for Hitler without question or hesitation. After that bloody night, no one doubted their devotion. When the war began, the Leibstandarte transformed from a ceremonial guard into a combat division. They led the invasion of Poland in September 1939, racing ahead of the regular army. They smashed through France in May 1940, capturing key positions before the defenders knew what hit them. They conquered Greece and Yugoslavia in 1941. On the Eastern Front, they earned a reputation for ferocity that terrified even the hardened soldiers of the Red Army. At Kharkov in 1943, they retook the city in some of the most brutal urban fighting of the war. Their casualties were appalling, but they never broke. They simply kept advancing, stepping over their dead to reach the enemy. The Western Allies first encountered the Leibstandarte in Normandy in 1944. The division fought with their customary savagery around Caen and in the Falaise pocket. By the time they retreated from France, they had been badly mauled, but the Nazi regime rebuilt them immediately, giving them priority for replacements and equipment. By December 1944, the division had returned to full strength. They received the best of everything: the newest tanks, the most advanced equipment, the most fanatical volunteers from across the Reich and beyond. When Adolf Hitler needed his finest troops for his last great gamble in the West, he naturally chose the Leibstandarte. The division rolled into the Ardennes with nearly 100 tanks, 50 Panzer IVs, the workhorses of the German armored force, 50 Panthers, with their devastating 75mm high-velocity guns and sloped armor that could deflect most American shells. Supporting them were the massive Tiger, 2 tanks of the 501st Heavy SS Tank Battalion, 42 of the most powerful armored vehicles on any battlefield in the world. Their commander was SS Brigade leader Wilhelm Mohnke, a veteran who had been with Hitler since 1933. Mohnke had commanded the Leibstandarte Panzergrenadier Regiment before taking over the entire division. He was a true believer who would follow Hitler into hell. But the real striking power of the division was concentrated in Kampfgruppe Peiper, the battle group that would lead the assault. This was the tip of the spear, designed to punch through American lines and race to the Meuse River before the Allies could react. Commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper was Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. He was 29 years old, impossibly young for such a responsibility by American standards, but Peiper had been fighting since 1939. He had served as Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant, handling the SS leader's most sensitive correspondence. He had won the Knight's Cross for bravery on the Eastern Front, where he led his men through some of the most intense fighting of the war. Piper was handsome, charismatic, and ruthless. His men worshipped him. He led from the front, sharing their dangers and hardships. He expected perfection and punished failure severely. His soldiers would follow him anywhere. Kampfgruppe Piper contained 4,800 men and 800 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, armored cars, artillery, everything needed for a deep penetration attack. They were organized for speed, designed to exploit any breakthrough before the enemy could react. Their mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution: punch through the American lines, reach the Meuse River in 24 hours, capture the bridges at High before the Americans could blow them, then drive to Antwerp and cut the Allied armies in half. Hitler believed this offensive would change the war. He believed his elite SS troops would shatter the soft Americans just as they had shattered everyone else. He believed the Leibstandarte would lead Germany to victory one more time. He would be proven catastrophically wrong. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. American positions disappeared under a storm of high explosives. Telephone lines were cut. Headquarters were demolished. Men who survived the shelling emerged deaf and disoriented. Then the German infantry advanced through the pre-dawn darkness. On Lanzerath Ridge, Lieutenant Bauch watched the shelling with growing alarm. His position overlooked the main road that Kampfgruppe Piper needed to use. He had requested permission to pull back. Permission was denied. He was told to hold his position and report enemy activity. The ridge was not much to look at. A few foxholes dug into frozen ground, some trees for concealment, a commanding view of the road below and the village of Lanzerath. Bauch had placed his men carefully, creating interlocking fields of fire that would tear apart any infantry assault. At 9:30 that morning, Bauch spotted movement. German paratroopers were advancing through the forest below his position, hundreds of them, moving toward a small American outpost in the village of Lanzerath. Bauch radioed his headquarters. He reported what he was seeing. He was told the Germans he was seeing were probably friendly troops. There were no Germans in that area. Intelligence was certain. Bauch knew what he was seeing. He watched the German paratroopers walk right past his hidden position, heading for the village. He had a choice: open fire and reveal his position to an overwhelming force, or stay hidden and let the Germans take the village unopposed. He stayed hidden and watched. The German paratroopers walked into Lanzerath. Within minutes, they had captured it. The small American outpost there surrendered without a fight. Now Bauch faced an even worse situation. The Germans controlled the village below him. More Germans were moving up the road. His 18 men were alone on a ridge, directly in the path of an entire Panzer division, with no hope of reinforcement or retreat. He could have surrendered. No one would have blamed him. His position was hopeless. But Lyle Bauch was not the surrendering type. What happened next would delay the entire German offensive and change the course of the Battle of the Bulge. Around noon, the first German attack came up the ridge. The paratroopers advanced in a standard infantry assault, expecting light resistance or none at all. Bauch's men opened fire. Their machine guns and rifles cut into the advancing paratroopers. Men fell screaming in the snow. Others dove for cover, pinned down by fire they had not expected. The Germans fell back, leaving dead and wounded scattered across the slope. They regrouped and attacked again. And again Bauch's men drove them back. The Germans could not understand what was happening. Their intelligence said this ridge was undefended. Yet every time they advanced, murderous fire erupted from hidden positions. The Americans had excellent fields of fire and the advantage of high ground. The paratroopers could not get close enough to assault the foxholes. A third attack came, then a fourth. Each time, the 18 Americans held their ground. Their ammunition was running low. Some men had been wounded, but they kept fighting. By mid-afternoon, the Germans had tried to take the ridge 5 times. Each attack had been thrown back with heavy losses. The snow was stained red with German blood. The paratroop colonel commanding the assault had lost patience. He had a schedule to keep. An entire Panzer division was waiting behind him. Behind the stalled paratroopers, Kampfgruppe Piper waited. Joachim Piper sat in his command vehicle, watching the hours slip away. His timetable called for him to be at the Meuse River by now. Instead, he was stuck behind his own infantry, waiting for them to clear a single ridge held by what he assumed must be a reinforced American company. There were 18 Americans on that ridge. Piper paced and fumed. He sent furious messages demanding faster progress. He threatened the paratroop commanders with courts-martial if they did not break through immediately. But threats could not change the tactical reality. His massive armored column was road-bound in the narrow forest paths. He could not bypass the ridge. He could not use his tanks effectively in the dense woodland. He had to wait for the infantry to do their job. As darkness fell, the Germans finally overwhelmed Buch's position. They had brought up mortars and concentrated fire on the American foxholes. One by one, Buch's men were killed or wounded or ran out of ammunition. By nightfall, the survivors were prisoners. But they had held through hours of intense combat, delaying the German advance for almost an entire day. They had inflicted over 90 casualties on the German paratroopers. Most importantly, they had given the Americans behind them precious time to react to the German offensive. When historians later studied the Battle of the Bulge, they concluded that Buch's stand at Lanzerath Ridge was one of the most significant small unit actions of the entire battle. The delay rippled through the German timetable in ways that would prove catastrophic for the Leibstandarte. Kampfgruppe Paper was supposed to reach the Meuse in 24 hours. Because of 18 men on a frozen ridge, they were already 12 hours behind schedule before they even started moving. The platoon would later become one of the most decorated small units in American military history. 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, 9 Bronze Stars with V device for valor, but that recognition would not come for decades. In December 1944, Buch's men simply vanished into German prisoner of war camps, and the chaos of battle erased their sacrifice from official records. By the time Kampfgruppe Piper finally began moving on the morning of December 17th, word of the German offensive had spread throughout the American command structure. Reserves were being mobilized. Reinforcements were on their way. The element of surprise, so crucial to Hitler's plan, was beginning to evaporate, but Piper was still dangerous. His column roared down the narrow roads of the Ardennes, scattering American rear area units that had no idea the Germans were so close. These were supply troops, headquarters personnel, artillery observers, men who had never expected to see German tanks in their sector. At Hansfeld, his tanks overran an American rest center before the soldiers there knew what was happening. Sleepy men stumbled out of buildings to find Panther tanks in the streets. Most surrendered immediately. Some were shot down as they ran. At Bullingen, Piper captured an American fuel depot and refueled his vehicles. This was exactly what the German offensive needed. Fuel was the critical limiting factor. Without captured American gasoline, the Panzers would grind to a halt long before reaching their objectives. Then came Malmedy. At a crossroads called Bognes, just south of the town of Malmedy, Piper's advance guard encountered Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans were caught completely in the open. Their vehicles were shot up in minutes. Around 113 men surrendered. What happened next would transform the Battle of the Bulge from an ordinary military operation into something far more personal for every American soldier. The German soldiers herded the American prisoners into a snow-covered field beside the road. The Americans stood there, hands raised, waiting to be processed and sent to the rear. That was how it was supposed to work. The Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners were to be protected. There are conflicting accounts about what triggered the shooting. Some survivors said a German officer gave an explicit order to fire. Others said nervous guards opened fire when some prisoners tried to escape. German accounts after the war offered various explanations and excuses. What is certain is that German machine guns opened fire on the unarmed Americans standing in that snowy field. 84 men died at Bognes. Some were shot while trying to flee across the open ground. Others were executed where they lay wounded, shot in the head by German soldiers walking among the fallen. A handful survived by playing dead, lying motionless under the bodies of their comrades, while German soldiers fired shots into anyone who moved. The survivors lay in that field for hours, afraid to move, listening to the Germans celebrate their victory. When darkness finally fell and the German column moved on, a handful of blood-soaked Americans crawled away and made their way to American lines. The word spread through the American army like an electric shock. The SS was shooting prisoners. The Malmedy massacre changed everything about the Battle of the Bulge. American soldiers who might have considered surrender when faced with overwhelming odds now knew what awaited them. Units that might have broken under pressure instead fought with desperate fury. The massacre was intended to spread terror among the Americans, to convince them that resistance was futile. Instead, it stiffened their resistance beyond anything the Germans expected. Men who might have wavered now fought knowing that capture meant death. Word of Malmedy reached every American unit in the Ardennes within days. Some commanders issued informal orders to take no SS prisoners. Whether or not those orders were widely followed, the massacre ensured that the fighting would be more bitter and more unforgiving than it might otherwise have been. As news of Malmedy spread, Piper's column continued west toward the Meuse. By the evening of December 17th, his advance elements reached the town of Stavelot. The bridge over the Amblève River was intact. Beyond it lay open roads to the Meuse and the ultimate objectives of the offensive. Piper had covered a remarkable amount of ground considering the delays at Lanzerath and the resistance he had encountered. His column stretched for miles along the narrow forest roads. His tanks were running low on fuel despite the capture at Bullingen. His men were exhausted from continuous movement and combat. Piper made a fateful decision. His men needed rest. It was dark, and night operations in unfamiliar territory were dangerous. He had reports of American forces ahead. Though he did not know their strength, he decided to wait until dawn to attack Stavelot. That single night would doom his entire mission. While Piper's men rested in their vehicles, American reinforcements raced toward Stavelot through the freezing darkness. The 30th Infantry Division, nicknamed Old Hickory, had been in reserve near Aachen, resting and refitting after months of hard fighting. They received orders to move south immediately. Every available truck was pressed into service. Through the night, their convoys crawled along icy roads toward the battle. Men who had expected a quiet Christmas found themselves rushing toward the sound of guns. They did not know exactly what they would face. They only knew the Germans had broken through and every man was needed. By dawn on December 18th, the first elements of the 30th Division reached Stavelot. They were barely in position, still organizing their defenses, when Piper's tanks attacked. The fighting was savage. German tanks and American infantry fought house to house through the narrow streets of the Belgian town. Stone buildings that had stood for centuries became fortresses and death traps. Tank shells punched through walls. Machine gun fire raked windows and doorways. Piper's men captured the bridge over the Amblève River intact, a crucial victory. But they could not secure the town itself. American infantry clung to buildings on the western side of Stavelot, refusing to be driven out. Every time the Germans cleared a street, American soldiers infiltrated back. Behind Piper's advance, American troops cut the road. The same narrow forest paths that channeled Piper's advance now became a trap. His supply line was severed. The ammunition and fuel he desperately needed could not reach him. West of Stavelot, American engineers were preparing a desperate defense that would shape the entire battle. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion had orders to hold the bridges over the Somme River at Trois Ponts. If those bridges fell into German hands, Piper would have a clear road to the Meuse River. Engineers are not assault troops. Their job is building and demolition, not frontline combat. But in the chaos of the German offensive, engineers found themselves fighting as infantry. The men at Trois Ponts knew their mission: hold until the bridges could be destroyed, then blow them in the enemy's face. At 11:30 on the morning of December 18th, German tanks appeared on the road to Trois Ponts. Piper's advance guard was probing for a way across the river. The lead Panther tank rolled toward the bridge. The engineers waited. They had wired the bridge with demolition charges. The detonator was ready, but they needed to time it perfectly. Too early, and the Germans might find another crossing. Too late, and the tanks would be across before the charges could blow. The Panther rolled onto the bridge. Behind it, more German vehicles were visible on the road. The engineer officer made his decision. He pressed the detonator. The explosion was enormous. The bridge span collapsed into the icy Somme River, carrying the Panther with it. Chunks of concrete and steel rained down. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing but a gap where the bridge had been. Piper watched the bridge fall. His planned route to the Meuse was gone. He would have to find another way west. He turned north, looking for another crossing. But the engineers were everywhere. Every bridge Piper approached seemed to explode just as his tanks reached it. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had been methodically destroying every crossing point, denying Piper the infrastructure he needed to advance. These were not elite combat soldiers. These were construction workers in uniform, men who had trained to build bridges and roads, not to fight tank battles. But when the crisis came, they became warriors. They held positions they were never meant to hold. They blew bridges while German tanks fired at them. They bought time with their lives. The story of the engineers in those December days deserves its own telling. Small groups of men, often without support or reinforcement, standing in the path of armored columns and refusing to break. When one bridge blew, they raced to the next. When one position fell, they established another. They were the sand in the gears of Piper's magnificent machine. The Americans were fighting a brilliant delaying action. They did not have the strength to stop Piper's panzers in a stand-up fight. But they did not need to. They only needed to slow him down, to buy time for reinforcements to arrive, to bleed away his strength one skirmish at a time. North of Stavelot, Piper's route took him toward something that could have changed everything. A massive American fuel depot sat near the village of Francorchamps. Over 1 million gallons of gasoline in drums and storage tanks. Enough fuel to keep Piper's offensive going indefinitely. Enough to take him all the way to Antwerp. If Piper captured that depot, the entire calculus of the battle would change. His panzers would have unlimited range. He could bypass obstacles and keep pressing west. The American defense might collapse under the weight of his armored thrust. The depot was guarded by Belgian soldiers and American service personnel. When word came that German tanks were approaching, Major Paul Solis, of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion, made a split-second decision that would shape the entire battle. He could not evacuate over 1 million gallons of gasoline. There were not enough trucks, and there was not enough time. He could not defend the depot against tanks with the handful of troops available. The Germans would roll right over them, but he could deny the fuel to the enemy. Solis ordered his men to roll fuel drums into the road leading to the depot. Then they punctured the drums and set them on fire. A wall of flame erupted across Piper's route. 124,000 gallons of American gasoline burned in a barrier that no tank could cross. The flames rose 30 feet in the air. The heat was intense enough to feel hundreds of yards away. Black smoke billowed into the winter sky. Behind that wall of fire, Solis and his men continued to destroy fuel. If they could not use it and they could not save it, they would make sure the Germans could not have it either. The closest Piper ever came to the fuel that might have taken him to the Meuse was watching it burn from half a mile away. He sat in his command vehicle, watching over 1 million gallons of gasoline that could have saved his offensive go up in flames. The decision to burn that fuel was made in seconds. There was no time to consult higher headquarters, no time to weigh options or calculate probabilities. Solis saw tanks coming and knew what he had to do. He made a choice that would ripple through the entire battle. That is how wars are really won. Not in the grand strategies of generals or the movements of army groups, in the split-second decisions of men like Paul Solis, who saw a problem and solved it with whatever was at hand. He had gasoline and matches. He used them. By December 19th, Kampfgruppe Piper had reached the village of Staumont. Here, at last, Piper ran into the full strength of the American defense. The 119th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Division had dug in around Staumont. These were veteran troops who had fought through France and into Germany. They knew their business. They had prepared positions in the stone buildings and on the surrounding heights. They had fields of fire planned for every approach. Supporting the infantry were tanks of the 740th Tank Battalion. American Shermans were individually no match for German Panthers or Tigers. They were lighter, less armored, with weaker guns, but they were there in numbers, and their crews knew how to use the terrain. The Americans also had artillery. Batteries of 105mm and 155mm howitzers were registered on every approach to Staumont. When the weather cleared, they would have air support as well. P-47, Thunderbolts loaded with bombs and rockets were waiting at airfields just behind the lines, and every man in the 119th Infantry had heard about Malmedy. The battle for Staumont raged for several days. German and American tanks dueled at point-blank range in the narrow streets. Infantry fought from house to house, room to room, sometimes hand to hand. The Americans gave ground slowly, making the Germans pay for every building with blood. Piper threw everything he had at Staumont. His Tigers and Panthers should have crushed the American Shermans. In open terrain, they would have, but in the close quarters of a village fight, the advantages of German armor were neutralized. The ranges were too short for the German guns to matter. American bazookas and tank destroyers could get close enough to knock out even the heaviest German vehicles. The fighting was apocalyptic. Buildings burned. Bodies lay frozen in the streets. The crack of tank guns and the chatter of machine guns echoed off stone walls. Neither side asked for quarter, and neither side gave it. By December 20th, Piper knew he was in trouble. His fuel was almost gone. His ammunition was running low. American forces were closing in from 3 sides. He was cut off from the rest of the division, with no prospect of relief. His elite Kampfgruppe was bleeding to death in the ruins of a Belgian village. He ordered his men to fall back to the village of L'Église, where he hoped to establish a defensive perimeter until relief arrived. Relief would never come. While Piper fought at Staumont, the rest of the 1st SS Panzer Division was struggling to break through to him. American resistance had stiffened everywhere along the front. The initial shock of the German offensive had worn off. Now the Americans were fighting back with fury. The 82nd Airborne Division had moved into the line north of Piper, blocking German attempts to widen the breakthrough. These were paratroopers, some of the toughest soldiers in the American army. They had jumped into Normandy and Holland. They were not intimidated by SS Panzer divisions. Artillery pounded every German movement. American observation planes spotted German columns on the roads and called in devastating fire. The clear weather that finally came after days of fog and snow was a death sentence for any German vehicle caught in the open. The division that was supposed to reach the Meuse in 24 hours was now fighting desperately just to survive. At L'Église, Peiper organized his defense in the stone buildings of the village. He had perhaps 800 combat-effective soldiers left from his original 4,800. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or scattered across 30 miles of Belgian forest. His tanks were nearly out of fuel and ammunition. American forces surrounded L'Église completely by December 21st. Artillery fire rained down on the village around the clock. American infantry probed the perimeter day and night, testing for weak points, wearing down the defenders. Snipers picked off any German who showed himself. The weather was brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow fell intermittently, covering the living and the dead alike. The wounded suffered terribly in the cold. Medical supplies were running out. There was no way to evacuate the injured. Inside the perimeter, German wounded filled the village church. The stone walls provided some protection from the shelling, but there was little the medics could do without supplies. Men died of wounds that would have been survivable with proper treatment. Ammunition ran critically low. Peiper rationed every round, every grenade, every mortar shell. His men were reduced to scavenging ammunition from the dead. Tank crews sat in their Panthers and Tigers with only a handful of shells remaining, unable to use their massive firepower. The irony was bitter. They had some of the finest tanks ever built, vehicles that could destroy any American armor at 2,000 yards. But without ammunition, they were nothing but steel coffins. The crews who had trained for years to master these machines now sat idle while American infantry closed in. Some of the men had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. They knew what it meant to be surrounded. They knew the desperation of watching supplies run out while the enemy tightened the noose. But this was worse. On the Eastern Front, they had fought for years. Here, their great offensive had collapsed in less than a week. Peiper radioed urgently for resupply. He needed fuel. He needed ammunition. He needed medical supplies. Division headquarters promised airdrops. The Luftwaffe would save them. On December 22nd, the Luftwaffe attempted an airdrop. German transport planes flew over L'Église and dropped supply containers. It was a desperate gamble. The drop zone was small, surrounded by American positions. The pilots were inexperienced in precision dropping. American anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. The men of Kampfgruppe Peiper watched the sky with fading hope. They heard the engines of the transport planes. They saw the parachutes blossoming above them. For a moment, it seemed like salvation was at hand. Then the wind caught the containers and carried them away from the German positions. Parachute after parachute drifted over American lines. 90% of the supplies fell into American hands. The containers drifted on their parachutes into the woods around the village, beyond the reach of the stranded Germans. The few supplies that landed inside the perimeter were not nearly enough to make a difference. American soldiers who recovered the German supplies found food, ammunition, and medical equipment. Supplies that Peiper's wounded critically needed were now being used against them. The Luftwaffe airdrop became one more bitter joke in a campaign full of them. By December 23rd, Peiper knew the situation was hopeless. His men had been fighting for a week without rest or resupply. They were out of tank ammunition. They had barely enough small arms ammunition for one more serious engagement. Fuel was completely exhausted. Every vehicle sat immobile, unable to move. The Americans were closing in. Their attacks were growing stronger as reinforcements arrived. It was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed the depleted German garrison. That night, Peiper radioed division headquarters one last time. He requested permission to abandon his vehicles and attempt to escape on foot through the American lines. After hours of delay, permission was granted. At 2 a.m. on December 24th, Christmas Eve, the survivors of Kampfgruppe Peiper slipped out of L'Église. They moved in small groups, navigating by compass, avoiding American positions. They carried only their personal weapons and whatever food they could stuff in their pockets. The march through the forest was a nightmare. Men who had been fighting for a week without sleep stumbled through frozen woods in darkness. Some collapsed and had to be carried. Others wandered off and were never seen again. The cold was brutal. Men who fell asleep would never wake up. They crossed American lines by luck and stealth. Some groups blundered into American positions and were captured. Others found gaps in the defenses and slipped through. Peiper himself led one of the groups, refusing to abandon his men even in defeat. Behind them, they left everything they could not carry. The tanks that had been the terror of Europe sat silent in the snow. The half-tracks and armored cars that had carried them through so many battles were abandoned like dead animals. The pride of the SS Panzer Force became trophies for American photographers. American troops entering L'Église on Christmas morning found a graveyard of German armor. 135 vehicles sat abandoned in the streets and fields around the village. 6 Tiger, 2 tanks, the most powerful armored vehicles in the German arsenal, 13 Panthers, 7 Panzer IVs, half-tracks and armored cars and trucks by the dozen, all out of fuel, all left behind. One of those Tiger II tanks still sits in L'Église today. Tank number 213 was purchased by the village after the war, reportedly for a bottle of cognac. The farmer who owned the field where it sat was happy to be rid of it. The tank now stands in front of the December 1944 museum, a silent monument to the battle that destroyed the Leibstandart's finest Kampfgruppe. American intelligence officers examined the abandoned vehicles with fascination. They had rarely had the opportunity to study German armor up close. The Tiger II was particularly interesting, a monster of a tank that outclassed anything the Americans could field. Now they had 6 of them, intact and available for detailed examination. Of the 4,800 men who had started with Kampfgruppe paper, fewer than 800 made it back to German lines. They staggered through the frozen forest on Christmas Eve, exhausted and defeated, their uniforms in tatters, their weapons often discarded to save weight. They had failed completely in their mission. Piper himself made it back. He would continue to fight until the end of the war, leading what remained of his regiment in the final desperate battles. But he would never forget L'Église. He would never forget watching his elite battle group bleed to death in those Belgian forests. But the destruction of the 1st SS Panzer Division was not yet complete. While Piper was surrounded at L'Église, the rest of the division had been fighting around the town of Bastogne. This Belgian crossroads had become the center of the American defense. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units were surrounded there, holding a vital road junction against repeated German attacks. Hitler considered Bastogne essential to his offensive. The roads through the town were critical for supplying any advance to the Meuse. As long as Bastogne held, German logistics would be strangled. He ordered it taken at all costs. The Leibstandarte was thrown into the assault. What remained of the division after Piper's disaster was committed to breaking the American perimeter around Bastogne. On December 29th, elements of the division attacked American positions east of Bastogne. The fighting was as brutal as anything on the Western Front. German and American soldiers fought in frozen forests and snow-covered fields, neither side giving ground willingly. At the village of Villers-le-Bon-Eau on December 30th, the Germans overran an American position. The defenders were elements of the 35th Infantry Division, troops who had been fighting since Normandy, now facing battle-hardened SS veterans. The fighting was savage. Of 169 American defenders, only 1 escaped to tell what happened. The rest were killed or captured in some of the most intense close combat of the battle. But these local successes could not change the strategic situation. American reinforcements poured into the Ardennes from every direction. Patton's Third Army had broken through to Bastogne on December 26th, ending the siege. The road to the town was open, and supplies and reinforcements flowed in constantly. The weather cleared in late December, allowing American aircraft to devastate German columns caught on the open roads. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs ranged across the battlefield, bombing and strafing anything that moved. German tanks that had seemed invincible on the ground were helpless against rockets and bombs from above. By January 1st, 1945, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Battalions that should have numbered 800 men were down to 80 or 100. Tank companies reported 2 or 3 operational vehicles instead of 17. The survivors were exhausted, frostbitten, and demoralized. The fighting around Bastogne continued for days. On January 10th, the division launched what would be its final major attack. This was Hitler's direct order: take Bastogne or die trying. The Leibstandarte attacked. American artillery from 3 divisions concentrated on the advancing Germans. Hundreds of guns fired simultaneously, dropping a curtain of steel on the attacking troops. The barrage was devastating. German soldiers who survived described it as the most intense shelling they had ever experienced. The attack collapsed before it reached the American lines. Men who had faced Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front, who had survived the hell of Kursk and Kharkov, broke and ran under the weight of American firepower. Adolf Hitler, watching the failure of his great offensive from his headquarters far from the front, reacted with characteristic fury. He blamed everyone but himself. He blamed his generals for timidity. He blamed his soldiers for weakness. He blamed his SS divisions, his personal guard, his chosen warriors, for lacking the will to win. The failure of the Ardennes offensive was Hitler's failure. He had conceived it. He had insisted on it, against the advice of his generals. He had committed resources Germany could not afford to lose on a gamble that was always doomed. But Hitler never accepted responsibility for anything. The fault must lie elsewhere. His SS divisions had failed him. The Leibstandarte, his bodyguard, the men who wore his name, had been stopped by ordinary American soldiers. This was intolerable. Someone must be punished. The Leibstandarte was pulled out of the Ardennes in mid-January 1945. Barely 1,500 combat-effective soldiers remained of the 16,000 who had started the offensive. Most of their tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Their supporting units were shattered. They were sent to Hungary for Operation Spring Awakening, another doomed offensive designed to protect the last oil fields available to the Third Reich. Hitler still believed in the offensive spirit. He still thought one more attack would turn the tide. Spring Awakening failed as completely as the Ardennes offensive. The Soviets had grown too strong. They had more men, more tanks, more guns, more aircraft. The Leibstandarte that had conquered nations now could barely hold a defensive line. It was after Spring Awakening collapsed in March 1945 that Hitler ordered a punishment that shocked even the hardened veterans of the Waffen-SS. The Leibstandarte and 3 other SS divisions were ordered to remove their cuff titles. These were the embroidered bands worn on the left sleeve that identified each division by name. For the Leibstandarte, the cuff title bore the words Adolf Hitler in silver thread. It was their greatest honor, the symbol of their special relationship with the Führer, the mark that set them apart from all other German units. Now Hitler ordered them stripped of that honor. He declared that they had proven unworthy of bearing his name. The men who had fought and died for him across Europe, who had committed atrocities in his name, who had followed him with absolute devotion, were now condemned as cowards and failures. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army and a man who had been with Hitler since the earliest days of the Nazi movement, reportedly refused to transmit the order. According to legend, he sent an orderly to collect decorations and medals from his troops with a chamber pot to return them to Hitler with an obscene message. Whether the story is true or not, it reflects the shock that ran through the SS at Hitler's betrayal. These men had given everything for him. They had committed crimes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And now he dismissed them as worthless. The order was never actually carried out. The chaos of the crumbling front made such administrative matters impossible. But the symbolism was devastating. Hitler had abandoned his favorite division. By April, they were retreating through Austria, fighting rear-guard actions against the advancing Red Army. The men who had once marched triumphantly through Paris now stumbled along muddy roads, their vehicles gone, their heavy weapons abandoned, just trying to survive long enough to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. When Vienna fell in April 1945, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had fewer than 1,600 men and 16 operational tanks, remaining from a full-strength division of over 16,000 men and over 100 tanks. On May 8, 1945, what was left of the division surrendered to American forces near the Austrian town of Steyr. The men who had once been the spearhead of Nazi conquest shuffled into prisoner-of-war camps, their black uniforms in tatters, their cuff titles long since discarded or hidden. Many would face war crimes trials for Malmedy and other atrocities committed during the war. The massacre at that Belgian crossroads would not be forgotten. Joachim Peiper himself was sentenced to death by the American military tribunal at Dachau in 1946. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors testified. Documents proved his command responsibility. The tribunal found him guilty of war crimes and condemned him to hang. The sentence was later commuted amid controversy. American investigators had used harsh interrogation methods to obtain confessions from German prisoners. Defense attorneys argued that the convictions were tainted. In the atmosphere of the early Cold War, with Germany becoming an ally against the Soviet Union, there was pressure to move on from wartime scores. Peiper was released from prison in 1956. He had served 11 years. He initially worked in Germany, then moved to France in 1972, settling in a small village in the east of the country. He worked as a translator for a German publishing house, keeping a low profile, avoiding publicity, trying to live out his days in peace. In 1976, someone discovered his identity and his past. French resistance veterans learned that the SS officer responsible for massacres in France and Belgium was living among them. Anonymous threats began arriving at his house. His neighbors shunned him. On July 14th of that year, Bastille Day, his house was firebombed in the middle of the night. Joachim Peiper died in the fire. He was 61 years old. The perpetrators were never identified or brought to justice. The survivors of Buch's platoon at Lanzerath Ridge had a different fate. They were liberated from German prisoner of war camps in April 1945. They returned home to a country that barely knew what they had done. The confusion of the first days of the Battle of the Bulge meant that few commanders even knew what had happened on that frozen ridge. Official records were incomplete or contradictory. For decades, their role in stopping the German offensive went unrecognized. They were ordinary soldiers who had done their duty. They came home, started families, built careers. They rarely spoke about the war. When they did, they spoke modestly, as veterans often do. It was not until 1981, after years of advocacy by survivors and military historians, that the platoon received proper recognition. Researchers had pieced together what had happened at Lanzerath. They had interviewed survivors on both sides. They had reconstructed the timeline and understood the significance of the delay. Every member of the platoon was decorated, making them one of the most honored small units in American military history. 4 men received the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. 5 received the Silver Star. 9 received the Bronze Star with V device for valor. Lyle Book himself was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership that day. He accepted the honor with characteristic humility. He returned to civilian life after the war, became a chiropractor in St. Louis, raised a family. When asked about the battle, he deflected credit to his men, saying they were the ones who held the line. Book never sought fame or recognition. He had done what any officer would do. He had led his men. He had held his position. The fact that holding that position changed the course of a battle was, to him, simply the fortunes of war. He was uncomfortable with the idea of being called a hero, but his men knew what he had done. They knew that when the easy choice was surrender, Book chose to fight. They knew that his leadership held them together when every instinct screamed to run. They remembered him standing in his foxhole, calmly directing fire, as if they were on a training exercise instead of facing 500 screaming paratroopers. Book lived until December 2, 2016. He died at the age of 92, just 2 weeks before the 72nd anniversary of the battle that made him famous. Every year until his death, survivors of the platoon gathered at Lanzerath to remember what had happened on that frozen ridge. Fewer came each year as age claimed them, but they never forgot. The Tiger II tank still stands in the Glaze. Tourists photograph it year-round. School children visit on field trips to learn about the war. Veterans and their families make pilgrimages to see the silent monument to the battle. Most visitors do not fully understand what they are looking at. They see a massive tank, impressive in its size and mechanical menace. They read the plaques explaining what happened in December 1944, but they cannot truly grasp the significance. That tank represents the end of an era, the death of the belief that elite soldiers and superior weapons could overcome determination and courage. The moment when Hitler's invincible bodyguard division discovered that ordinary Americans, fighting on frozen ground with rifles and guts and improvised tactics, could break them. The 9 days from December 16th to December 24th, 1944, were not the largest battles of the war. They were not the most strategically significant. The ultimate failure of the Ardennes offensive was determined by many factors beyond what happened to the Leibstandarte, but they were the moment when Germany's finest division met its end in the snowy forests of Belgium. Stopped by 18 men on a ridge who should have retreated and chose to fight. Blocked by engineers who blew bridges under enemy fire. Burned by a supply officer who created a wall of fire from gasoline cans rather than let the enemy have the fuel. Surrounded by infantry divisions that refused to give ground no matter the cost. Destroyed by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small acts of courage and defiance and desperate improvisation. That is how elite divisions die, not in one great catastrophe, but in 1,000 small defeats, each one inflicted by ordinary soldiers doing extraordinary things, each one buying time that could never be recovered, each one bleeding away strength that could never be replaced. The men who stopped the Leibstandarte did not know they were making history. Lieutenant Book thought he had failed when his platoon was captured. The engineers at Trois-Ponts did not know they were changing the course of a campaign when they blew that bridge. The officers who ordered the fuel burned were just trying to deny resources to the enemy with whatever means they had available. They knew only that they had a job to do, and they did it. That is the lesson of those 9 December days in 1944. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.